Okay, friends, let's make a start. So I'm Philip McCosker, the director of the von Hügel Institute, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you most warmly to the annual von Hügel lecture for 2020. It's wonderful to see so many of you here, and many fresh faces too. Welcome. As many of you know, but it's worth repeating today, the von Hügel Institute for Critical Catholic Inquiry, or the VHI as we tend to call it, is an interdisciplinary research institute anchored in the idea of Catholicity, with a small c, which we understand primarily in its etymological sense from the Greek katholou, meaning according to the whole. So at the heart is an integrating or holistic optic. Our group of over 30 researchers work in a riotous plurality of disciplines, always trying to perceive and analyse more and more of that whole of reality, bringing together hopefully the micro and the macro, the practical and the theoretical. So we hope we are a place of constructive critique in the best sense, a sort of four-way conversation between the church, the religions, the academy and the world, exploring and harnessing our differences to further our common good. We are named after Anatole von Hügel, not his more famous brother Friedrich. Anatole was an intrepid anthropologist, explorer of Fiji, who combined his scholarly attention to anthropological particularities with founding both St Edmund's College and Fisher House, the Catholic chaplaincy in this university, as places to foster that integrally Catholic spirit within Cambridge. Our von Hügel lecturer this year, His Eminence Cardinal Michael Fitzgerald, has had an extremely distinguished international career promoting interreligious life and practice around the world. Father Michael is clearly a man who embodies much of Anatole's spirit. Born in Warsaw, he joined the Missionaries of Africa, going on to study in the UK, the Netherlands, Tunisia, where he started to learn Arabic and about Islam. Further studies in Rome during the heady years of the Second Vatican Council brought him in contact with renowned theologians such as Bernard Lonergan, Karl Rahner and Yves Congar. After yet further studies, this time at SOAS, Father Michael taught in Uganda and became head of the Pontifical Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies in Rome. He returned to Africa as a pastor of a parish in Sudan. In 1987, he became secretary of what became later the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue in Rome, and in 2002 was appointed president of that council by John Paul II. In turn, Benedict XVI appointed him Apostolic Nuncio to Egypt and delegate to the League of Arab Nations, positions he held until 2012. Since then, he has been based in Jerusalem and now in Liverpool. Strikingly, he did not know of his appointment as cardinal by Pope Francis when it was made public. At that time, he was preaching in an Anglican church. So, from such extensive experience, both within the church and in the Middle East, at both the micro and the macro level, he clearly has much to share with us. And we are especially lucky because His Eminence very kindly stepped in at extremely short notice to give this lecture when Jean-Luc Marion wrote to say that he had to be in the Académie Française today, rather inconveniently. So thank you very much indeed, Your Eminence, for making the time at such short notice to come and talk with us today. Practicalities. Father Michael will address us for about an hour, after which we'll have about 20-30 minutes for questions and interactions. You are then all most welcome to attend a service of sung Vespers in the chapel directly opposite for our commemoration of benefactors. That's at 6:15, at which the Cardinal will be preaching. As usual, I must say this is a public event, and so there's obviously filming happening, and there'll be some photographs. If you do not wish to appear in those on our website, please let myself or Lydia know. But without further ado, plenty of seats at the front, please do go on. Further ado, please welcome Cardinal Fitzgerald to address us under the title, Christians in the Arab World, the Present Situation.
Is that on now? Yes. So first of all, I would like to say thank you to Dr. McCosker for inviting me to speak here this afternoon, even if I'm just stepping in. Excuse my voice. And I'd like to thank all of you here present for coming to listen to some considerations on the situation of... There's plenty of room in the front. So, coming to listen to some considerations on the situation of Christians in the Arab world. Pope Francis often complains about indifference towards the plight of Christians in this region, and I think that your presence shows that you are not indifferent. So this topic will transport us for a while to another part of the world, and that, I think, fits in with this Catholicity, which has been chosen as the theme of the year for the von Hügel Institute. Christians in the Arab world, the present situation, it's a rather general title. I preferred the Arab world to the Middle East because I'm going to include North Africa in this rapid survey. It's going to be a rapid survey, even if I speak for an hour. And I hope that after that other people will be able to fill in some of the gaps with their own experiences of that area. I'm speaking about Christians rather than Catholics, but I don't pretend to give a complete coverage of all the different churches and denominations that exist in this region. And I've chosen a very neutral term, situation, rather than persecution or suffering. I do intend to say something about the ways in which Christians are suffering, and at the end I'll ask the question, what can interreligious dialogue do in such a context? I want to start with the sufferings, but by describing some of the difficulties or sufferings that Christians are enduring in other places, not just in the Arab world. For instance, in Pakistan, Christian communities exist and are allowed to function, even if they form only a tiny minority of the population. In Pakistan, as I'm sure you know, it's the laws against blasphemy which give rise to so many problems, because these laws can be invoked for many reasons, and public opinion is easily aroused against those who are accused of defamation of the Prophet Muhammad or of desecration of the Quran. But also many people, both Christians and Muslims in Pakistan, are advocating the abolition of these laws, or at least the amendment of the laws of blasphemy. But so far, no government has been willing to tackle the question. Different part of the world, Nigeria, particularly in the north of the country, has in recent years been witnessing multiple attacks against churches and Christian communities. And at the moment I'm living with a fellow missionary who was in Burkina Faso for many years, and Burkina is also suffering from attacks of jihadists who are attacking both Christians and Muslims. So these attacks are often instigated by Boko Haram, an Islamic movement opposed to Western culture. It considers this Western culture to be destructive of Islam. They're in favor of a strict application of Sharia which has already been introduced in some northern states of Nigeria. The federal government is blamed by some for negligence and weakness in opposing Boko Haram, but I don't think that federal government of Nigeria can be accused of persecution of Christians. I myself make a distinction between persecution perpetrated by the state and violence against Christians carried out by individuals or groups. Of course, those who are undergoing the suffering, whether it's persecution or not, doesn't make any difference, really. It's purely academic. A third country I'd like to mention before coming to the Arab world is China. The government of the People's Republic of China protests that it is not against the existence of different religions, and in fact, Buddhist, Christian and Muslim communities exist within this huge country. What the government aims to do is to exercise control over these religions, and that's why it set up the Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association to govern the affairs of the Catholic community. The main objection of the government is to the recognition of the authority of the Holy See, particularly with regard to the appointment of bishops, since this is considered as a foreign interference in national affairs. Those Catholics who wish to maintain the link with the Holy See and obedience to the Holy Father, especially church leaders such as bishops and priests, often find themselves in prison or subject to re-education. But that re-education is not confined to Christians, it's also to the Muslims, the Uyghur in the western part of China. They're also going under re-education. Things change, and the Holy See has made a provisional agreement with China concerning the appointment of bishops, and that is opposed by, as you know, by some Catholics. In China, churches do exist and communities are able to gather for worship. By way of contrast, and now we come to the Arab world, in Saudi Arabia, the public practice of Christianity is forbidden, and no churches are allowed to exist in that country. The official line is that Christians are free to practice their religion in private. No public gathering for worship is permitted. A prominent Saudi, a member of the Shura, that was the King's Advisory Council, told us in the Council for Interreligious Dialogue some years ago that his sister, a Muslim like himself, was not allowed to speak in public because the authorities were afraid of her influence over people, especially women. So this control in Saudi Arabia is not just a question of religion, it's a question of questioning the authority of the rulers. Although there are millions of Christians present in Saudi Arabia as foreign workers, technicians, traders, any public manifestation of Christianity is prohibited, and people are put in prison if they are found with Bibles or religious publications in their possession. And yet even there things are evolving, because Saudi Arabia is engaged in dialogue and has founded an institute for dialogue, not in Arabia but in Vienna. But even so, that's a sign that things are changing. I would say that Saudi Arabia is, in fact, an exception. Because in the other countries of the Arabian Peninsula, whether Bahrain, Kuwait, the Gulf states, the Emirates, Qatar and Oman, and also in Yemen, Christians are allowed to gather for worship. And in a number of these states, such as Dubai and Abu Dhabi, the rulers have granted land for the construction of churches. In October of 2016, I was invited to Abu Dhabi to preach a retreat for the priests of the Southern Vicariate of Arabia, not only for Abu Dhabi, but the Emirates and Oman. The people from Yemen couldn't come because of the war. It's really amazing to see the thousands of people who attend the Catholic Church there. And previously in Qatar I was in a conference and was invited to say Mass in a parish church some way outside the capital. 6 o'clock in the morning. There were 100 people for Mass. 6 o'clock in the morning. Would you have that at Fisher Club? Yeah. Mostly Indians and Filipinos, but before going to work they want to go to Mass. Extraordinary. In Abu Dhabi, the cathedral was built in 1983 to hold about 800 people. That's too small. So a second larger church has now been built in the same compound. And even when the two churches are being used at the same time, there's not enough room for everyone. And people are in the courtyard attending Mass by watching it on the screen. I remember looking at the notice board and seeing that for the weekend, because it's Friday, Saturday and Sunday, there were at least 15 Masses in English and as many Masses in other languages as well. And within the compound, the church is free to act as it wishes, organizing catechism classes, holding meetings for different groups of people, selling books and whatever. But of course the Christians are not allowed to propagate their religion in the country. Within their own compound it's fine, but not outside. But there are schools run by women religious, schools that attract many pupils. Of course, the majority of these pupils are Muslims. So there is a tolerance for Christians there. Let me move from the Arabian Peninsula to North Africa. Morocco, as in other countries of North Africa, churches exist, yes, but they are confined to foreigners. And the same is true of Mauritania. Mauritania officially styled as an Islamic republic. The Catholic Diocese of Nouakchott, founded in 1965, where the bishop is a confrere of mine, serves about 5,000 Catholics in Mauritania, mostly foreign residents from West Africa and from Europe. There are extreme restrictions on freedom of religion and belief in this country of Mauritania. It is in fact one of the 13 countries in the world which punish atheism by the death penalty. That doesn't apply to Morocco. But in Morocco, any form of Christian propaganda is severely prohibited because it's considered as a form of proselytism. In Algeria and Tunisia, there are some local Christians, Algerians who are Christians, Tunisians who are Christians, mainly Protestants, not Catholics. Their existence appears to be tolerated, and yet converts to Christianity are liable to be prosecuted and punished. The government of Algeria has stipulated that worship can only be held in officially recognized buildings. That was really against the Protestants, who tend to have house churches and can't do that. Has to be an official building that is recognized, and that does make it difficult and even dangerous for any celebrations to take place outside of a church. For instance, I know of one priest who went off with some students for a day's outing, and celebrated Mass outside. He was arrested and put in prison, because he'd celebrated Mass in a place that you're not allowed to do it. So that happens. Also, the Algerian government is very loath to give visas to priests who are coming. We have difficulty in getting people there. Our society was founded in Algeria, and we've always been in Algeria for 150 years. But we have difficulty in sending people there now. The bishop in the Sahara is British. He was a major in the army before becoming a white father, and he's been appointed bishop there. He's okay. He's got a visa. It must be said that the Algerian government is not absolutely opposed to Christianity. And the sign of that is the acceptance of the beatification of the Algerian martyrs. Come, have a seat. You know the Algerian martyrs. Bishop Claverie was a Dominican, like Father Alban, who was a Dominican, and he and his Muslim chauffeur were murdered with a bomb. 18 companions have been beatified. They were beatified on the 8th of December of 2018. And there are 4 of my own confreres who are among that number of martyrs. The national and local authorities contributed greatly to the success of the celebrations. And these celebrations took into account the fact that not only Christians had been put to death in Algeria, suffered, but many, many Muslims too, including over 100 imams who had been killed, eliminated. With regard to religious liberty, I think it's worth noting that Morocco and Tunisia both have small but officially recognized Jewish communities. Nearby is Libya, where the Christian communities are made up or were made up of foreigners, Filipinos, men and women working in the medical services, a good number of Polish Catholics active in different fields. But because of the war that is going on there since the fall of Gaddafi, I think many of these Catholics have been forced to leave. The church is still there, Catholic Church is still there, served by the Franciscans, still present. In the countries of North Africa, as in the Gulf, Christians, with the exception perhaps of Algeria and Tunisia, Christians are almost entirely expatriates. But in the other countries of the Middle East, there are indigenous Christian communities. communities whose existence predates the rise of Islam. Egypt, where I served for 6.5 years, is the country with the largest number of Christians, estimated to be about 10% of the population. Since the population is almost 100 million now, that makes at least about 10 million, which is a good size. No? The majority of these Christians belong to the Coptic Orthodox Church. In Egypt, one could say that though Christians and Muslims have been living side by side for centuries, ever since the advent of Islam in that country in the 7th century, sectarian violence has been almost endemic. Because when disputes occur, they often take on a religious colour. They're not necessarily religious. There was a rich businessman who had his nice house just near the road, and he happened to be a Christian. He objected to the traffic going along at high speed just in front of his house. So he got the police to put in what the French call policing, sleeping policemen, humps. That didn't please the population. They didn't like these humps. So they took it out on the Christians, because this man was a Christian. It had nothing to do with religion, but things are coloured that way. I was in Egypt at the time of the Arab Spring. I think there were 3 main grievances which brought people to demonstrate against the government. Oppression by dictatorial regime, tight control of information, and the increasing gap between the rich and the poor. And to these grievances corresponded the desire for a greater possibility of political involvement, greater freedom of expression, and a better distribution of wealth. And these revolutionary movements, not only in Tunisia, in Egypt, in other countries as well, they were mainly initiated by young people. And in Egypt it was Muslims and Christians together. They were not religiously motivated, nor were they ideological. They were aimed at obtaining greater freedom, more justice, and true respect for human dignity. But since the forced resignation of President Mubarak as a result of these demonstrations, and the rise to power of Islamists, and then the army intervention to depose President Mohammed Morsi, a Muslim brother who had been elected, probably elected as president. There had been many attacks against Christians because the Christians were blamed for this turning against Morsi. But the Christians are 10%, and it was the majority of people who actually turned against Morsi, not just the Christians. And there have been much violence, the destruction of churches, shops, dwellings, and of course the public support, slaughter of Coptic workers in Libya, and so on. I think it would be wrong to speak about the persecution of Christians in Egypt. Certainly the government is not against Christians. The president, Sisi, has gone out of his way to show respect for Christians. And yet Christians complain that the forces of order don't give them sufficient protection. And they do complain of discrimination, but they complained about that before. But freedom of worship exists, and the churches of the various Christian communities are very well frequented. But there's no complete freedom of religion. It's very difficult, not to say impossible, for an Egyptian Muslim to embrace the Christian faith and to be officially recognized as a Christian. And there are legal dispositions which go against Christians. If a married Christian man converts to Islam, he doesn't like his wife, so he wants to marry someone else, so he wants to take a second wife, or wants to marry a Muslim woman, so he becomes a Muslim. His children are considered to be Muslims. They have no choice. He is a Muslim, the father is a Muslim, so the children are Muslims. There was a case that happened while I was in Egypt. This happened, a man had become a Muslim, and so his children, he had two twin boys, aged about 12, who suddenly became Muslims, or were considered as Muslims. So they had to sit their exam for religious knowledge, and they were presented with a paper on Islam. And they both wrote on the paper, "Ana Masihi," I'm a Christian. And they refused to answer the questions. They refused to sit the paper. Of course, there was a hullabaloo, and they were made to sit it again. And they were presented with the same paper. And again, encouraged by their mother, who stayed Christian, they wrote again, "Ana Masihi," I'm a Christian. And eventually they were allowed to accede to the further studies. So the authorities stepped back. Turning to a different country in the Middle East, in Syria, the conflict which has been going on for many years has brought immense suffering to Christians as to other citizens of the country. Already in November of 2014, the years go by so quickly, Pope Francis and Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople made a joint statement, and they said, "Many of our brothers and sisters are being persecuted, have been forced violently from their homes. It even seems that the value of human life has been lost, that the human person no longer matters and may be sacrificed to other interests. And tragically, all this is met by the indifference of many. As St. Paul reminds us, if one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together." A group of Jesuits involved in the Middle East wrote 2 years later, in June of 2016, according to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, 13.5 million Syrians, out of an estimated population of 22 million, need humanitarian aid. So over half of the inhabitants of the country needed humanitarian aid. 4.8 million have already left the country to seek refuge in neighbouring countries or in Europe. And 6.6 million are displaced within their own country because of violence. Of course, the majority of these suffering people are Muslims, but there are many Christians among them too. And sometimes Christian churches and other properties belonging to the church have been targeted. It's because they have been taken over by armed forces and used as bases from which to engage in combat. And it's also true that the strongly Islamic character of many of the forces of opposition has led them to acts of violence against Christians. So when areas of Syria have been taken over by Islamist groups, they've often imposed a strict interpretation of Islamic law, including the payment of jizya, a special tax levied on those who refuse to embrace Islam. And yet, even in Syria, the situation is changing, and people are going back to Aleppo, which is a very Christian city, and Christians are still there and groups are still there helping people. In Iraq too, where the Catholic Chaldean Church was the largest Christian body, attacks are being carried out on Christians by different groups, particularly, of course, by the Islamic State. Fortunately, that has been defeated. It would be difficult to blame the government of Iraq for these attacks, but Christians do feel that they are not sufficiently protected. And many have sought refuge in the areas run by the Kurds. Reports speak of 125,000, mainly Christian but also Yazidis, who took refuge in this area of Kurdistan or in other countries. Following the defeat of these forces of Daesh, of the Islamic State, in Mosul, for example, Christians have been able and are being encouraged to return to their homes. There is an immense work of reconstruction to be undertaken, and it's not easy. I read recently a report, a journalist writing, despite the routing of ISIS, Daesh or Islamic State 2 years ago, and a relatively stable security system in Iraqi Kurdistan, many displaced Christians are wary of returning to their homes. For some, their homes have been destroyed outright. For others, there exists no guarantee of employment or services. Others still are held back by a lingering sense of mistrust toward their Muslim neighbours. Even though damaged homes have been undergoing reconstruction with the support of the Church and international organisations, many people remain too discouraged to return until better conditions prevail, such as some guarantee of services, job opportunities, and most importantly, safety. With very little representation in political and administrative institutions, many Christians here say they do not feel they have a place in the country. Let's turn to the Holy Land, Israel, Jordan, and Palestine. I'll give you some statistics. Christians are very few. The proportion of Christians is estimated to be as follows. Israel, about 250,000, which would be 2.5% of the population. Jordan, 220 to 225,000, 3% of the population. Palestine, 50,000, 1.2% of the population. And these communities of Christians form a mosaic of churches. It's not just one church, there are all sorts of different communities. In Egypt there were seven churches, 7 Catholic churches, not to count the others. And I'm talking of communities, not buildings. So the most important in the Holy Land are the Greek Orthodox, the Latin Rite Catholics of the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem, and the Greek Catholic or Melkite Church. I think a distinguishing feature of the local Christian communities in Jordan and Palestine is that their members are Arabs, and so they are fully integrated into society. You might say, but that's the same in Syria and in Iraq, but in Iraq the Chaldeans, they don't speak Arabic, they speak Surat. They speak a different language. And some of the Lebanese will tell you, well, we're not Arabs. We're Phoenicians. We don't want to be Arabs. They're Maronites. Of course they speak Arabic, but anyway. Archbishop Maroun Laham, a former auxiliary of the Latin Patriarch in Amman, talked about the situation in 2017. He said that the Christians in Jordan and Palestine know very well that they constitute minorities in their countries. They don't like to use this term, preferring to speak of being few in number. But their historical experience has forged the mentality of a minority. What is that? He says, it is an exaggerated sense of their own identity. We are different. A tendency to seek protection from outside. Fear of engaging in the public square. Overemphasis on perceived discrimination. On the other side, the Muslim majority tends to dominate and doesn't always pay sufficient attention to the rights of the minority. In Palestine, particularly in the occupied territories, Christians suffer from the limitations on freedom of movement imposed by the occupying power, the Israeli. The bishops of the Holy Land Coordination Group, who visit the Holy Land every year, declared in a statement after their visit this year, during which they met in particular with Christians in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and in Ramallah, they said, "We are inspired by their enduring resilience and faith in a worsening situation." A worsening situation. It gets worse all the time. In fact, an Egyptian who was the head of the cabinet of the foreign minister, or the secretary of the Arab League, said to me, "Your English language is insufficient, is faulty. You need another word. You need to say worser, because things always get worse. And they're never worst. It's never the worst, because they still can get worser." And that, unfortunately, is what is happening. The bishops on that visit, in their statements, said they had witnessed how construction of settlements and the separation wall is destroying any prospect of two states existing in peace. I think that is very true. During demonstrations provoked by the closure of the Haram al-Sharif, that is the Al-Aqsa, the esplanade where the Dome of the Rock is. It's above the Temple Mount for Jews. There was a closure of the Haram al-Sharif decided by the Muslim authorities as a reaction to the decision of Israel to set up metal detector at the gates to prevent people going in there with knives or coming out with knives and attacking people. Oh, there were demonstrations. The Catholic priests were exhorting the members of their parish communities not to resort to violence. They understand that the frustration which continued Israeli occupation arouses, but they teach that violence has no part in the Christian way of life, and so they promote non-violent ways of protest. You tell me when to to stop. What can we do about this situation? I think, personally, that the Synod of Bishops for the Middle East had really tried to prepare Catholics for this moment, for this time, for all this frustration. The apostolic exhortation that followed that synod, Ecclesiae Medio Oriente, the church in the Middle East, stated that Catholics of the Middle East, the majority of whom are native citizens of their countries, have the duty and right to participate fully in national life, working to build up their country. They should enjoy full citizenship and not be treated as second-class citizens or believers. I think it's worth noting that two words used, participation in national life, is both a right and a duty. Because, as Marun Raham had said, the tendency of the minorities is to stay out of the fray, not to get engaged, not to get involved in order to protect themselves. It was interesting in Egypt, during this Arab Spring, the Catholic Church organized conferences to instruct particularly young people about their duties, civic duties, and about the system, because a new constitution was going to be presented, explaining constitutional matters so that there would be a true understanding of the importance of the referendum and that they would go and vote. Unfortunately, the victory, as I've said, in the parliamentary elections of the Islamist tendency, Muslim Brothers and Salafists, and the subsequent election of a Muslim brother as president quashed the enthusiasm of Christians. There was great enthusiasm in the first round of the election. Everybody was out to vote. But when they heard that the Islamists were winning, instead of going out to vote massively, they said, what's the use of voting? And that's happened. The Jesuits of the Middle East said again, after the hopes of the Arab Spring had raised, Christians and a good number of the inhabitants of the area now live in deep uncertainty. The situation at that time, they said, it remains relatively stable in Egypt, but it is volatile and uncertain in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Libya, where military operations have become increasingly international. It is not possible to forget the situation in the Holy Land, where the lack of political settlement creates permanent tensions between Palestinians and Israelis, leading to outbursts of violence from which both peoples suffer. So these Jesuits call for free speech and the development of democracy. They state education for citizenship requires genuine familiarity with human rights and reflection about the concept of laicity, of secular, understood citizenship that recognizes and respects cultural and religious plurality. Under these conditions, religion will have its appropriate place in the public arena and will be able to make positive contributions to living together. They insist that the true nature of Christian identity, which cannot be simply defined in opposition. As a Christian, I'm not just not a Muslim or not a Jew. It can't be reduced either to the observance of liturgical traditions or considered as a plus value in plans being made for migration, I'm a Christian, so I can migrate to a Christian country like the United States. It doesn't work. They speak of spiritual resistance, by which they mean the sense of belonging to Christ in order to find again the meaning of a presence that is sometimes undermined by violence and intolerance, or threatened by individualistic and consumerist trends. Such spiritual roots, they say, will bring renewed impetus to make God's care, proximity and mercy known in different social realities, especially in education, in healthcare and in development. To live that Christian identity is not an easy task, and it could be considered as a call to heroism. And I think that people are in a conflict, people in religious authorities. The bishops in the Middle East, they will all say, you must stay here. You have a vocation to stay here. This is where Christianity was born. You must stay. They say that in the morning. And in the evening, they telephone to Canada and to someone they know in Canada and say, my nephew is looking for a job. Would you be able to find a job for him in Canada? So on the one hand they say you must stay here, and on the other, out of goodwill, they want to facilitate the emigration of people. We're caught between the two. Because many people are fleeing from the areas of conflict. I could go on, there's lots of things, but maybe, what shall I say? I haven't said anything about interreligious dialogue. What can it do? Well, maybe we can talk about that afterwards. I don't think that dialogue can solve problems. Dialogue has to go on beforehand. When there's a conflict, it's too late for dialogue, really. And the problems are not religious. They're not just religious. They are they're political, and the solution has to be political. I think that the limitations of interreligious dialogue have to be respected. Dialogue can't eliminate the persecution of Christians or the suffering of Christians or of any other religious minority. Peace can only come about through negotiations. And that means establishing a climate of confidence. Now, in doing that, yes, interreligious dialogue has a role, getting to know people, getting to know the leaders of other communities, establishing relations with them so that you can resist influences that come from outside. It can help, perhaps, to prevent. It is, I think, dialogue is preventive medicine rather than curative medicine. We hear much about persecution and violence, and that's what I've talked about mainly, because these hit the headlines. The absence of conflict is not considered to be newsworthy. We say when things are bad, someone is sick, no news is good news. I haven't heard anything, so everything must be all right. I think for journalists, good news is no news, unfortunately. So we have to try to say what is being done, and that things are being done, and reconstruction. So I had a little conclusion, which is a sort of prayer, an invocation, based on the life of St. Francis of Assisi, as we were celebrating last year the 800th anniversary of his visit to the Sultan of Egypt in Damietta. So I said, almost blind, Francis sang of the beauty of God's creation. In the very heart of war, he recognized God's presence in the heart of the enemy. Recognizing himself to be a sinner among sinners, he wept at the thought of God's mercy. Through his intercession, may we, despite our blindness, be humble yet grateful peacemakers, and so be worthy children of our